Good evening and welcome everybody to tonight's event. Thank you for joining us here in the webinar, also on YouTube and Facebook and our own website. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, Community Spaces in Lockdown. This is a JW3 event and it's part of the 2020 London Festival of Architecture. Tonight, we'll be examining how this very particular moment in time impacts upon shared spaces. Spaces where we used to gather, watch art, make art, meet each other, work together, and get about the business of making different kinds of communities. For JW3, our program is currently online. So our film screenings, classes and courses, book launches, discussions such as these are all virtual. Our state-of-the-art, award-winning multi-purpose building is currently used as the largest hub for food banks in North Camden. It's been also a blood bank at times, and so far, 15,000 meals prepared in our demonstration kitchen have been delivered locally through homeless shelters and local mutual aid groups. We are, for the first time, seriously tackling food poverty locally. This moment in time will change us, and when we will return differently as individuals and as communities. We have a fantastic panel assembled here ready to discuss this. It's chaired by Will Jennings, who I'll just introduce before he introduces the panel. Will Jennings is a writer, visual artist. He's interested in the intersection of architecture with wider culture, economics, environment, and politics. He's a fellow of the 2020 Future Architecture Platform, and a book of his work will be published by Canalside Press in 2021. We're also very privileged to have Fanny Kusturu, Jeremy Goldstein, Lauren Townsend, and Alex Lifshutz, who will introduce. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, thank you everyone for joining us virtually from your bedrooms, homes, and mobile phones, wherever you are. And thank you for avoiding the busy, crowded parks. So yeah, as Michaela says, it's fascinating because JW3 is a place I used to work, I know very well, and it really works with the community. But like so many spaces and so many cultural spaces or churches and all kinds of, we'll talk about what different kinds of community and what space means later, but all kinds of spaces are now being repurposed, adapted, or reconsidered for the various, many problems that we face collectively. So we're going to talk about some of those spaces, some of those solutions, and also I think the intersection between culture and community, and the economics and the spatial issues which relate to them all. So I'm going to be joined by Jeremy Goldstein, who's an artist, producer and HIV plus activist with ACT UP London. For 3 decades, he's championed underrepresented voices and new forms of artistic and political expression. And he's the founder and director of London Artist Projects and the creator of the internationally acclaimed Truth to Power Cafe, which will be visiting JW3, I think on the 21st of January as part of Holocaust Memorial Day. And also was a really key part of joining up with LFA for the festival this year with the theme of power, and really taking power out to questioning who has power and asking all of those voices to speak up about it. Also joined by Lauren Townsend, who's a Yorkshire-based emerging creative producer working in theatre, live events, film and community arts, and a commitment to engaging all communities in the arts, and we'll talk about this later, inside and outside the traditional theatre space, increasing diversity in the creative workforce at the core of her practice. And she's extremely interested in establishing, as we all are and increasingly should be, cross-collaboration between mediums and art forms. She also runs the very busy at the moment digital programme at the Lawrence Batley Theatre in Huddersfield. Alex Lifshutz, who many of you won't need an introduction to, is a director of Lifshutz Davidson Sandilands Architects. They designed the JW3 building, which we would all be in tonight, and I encourage you to visit when we're back to normal, if we want to get back to normal. With a degree in sociology and psychology and research in cognitive psychology, he studied at the Architectural Association in London, worked at Foster Associates before starting his own firm, which has gone on to create all kinds of cultural and community buildings since. And lastly, but not leastly, Fanny Kosturu, who's an associate at the excellent think tank Teatrum Mundi, where they lead on research in design and creative development. And Fanny herself is trained in architecture and urban studies at NTU Athens and in ETH Zurich and UCL London, all of the acronyms there. And she teaches at the Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff and CanActions in Kiev. So if you can all introduce yourselves into the shared digital room, unmute and uninvisibilize yourself. I'd like to start by asking Alex if you can hear me. It's always weird talking into a computer, hoping there's someone there. But Alex, if you could just talk about, not everyone will know the JW3 building, and without giving us a tour of the building, but you designed it for a particular purpose, a particular community and relationship in and out of that community. And obviously it's now being repurposed, and with climate breakdown, a lot of architecture will have to increasingly be repurposed and thought about to be adapted. So can you talk about what it's like to see your architecture change use, change purpose, be adapted and altered in such a time?
Yes, thanks, and thanks everyone for listening. It's worth just mentioning that prior to the building, JW3 was a virtual presence. When Vivienne Duffield started the project, she, I think quite wisely, thought, well, let's just see what the appetite is for a home for Jewish culture in London. And the whole project was on the web. Events happened in various locations around London, and it was a very nimble and a very versatile approach to making a community. So its roots are actually in a sort of form of communication that we're now becoming much more familiar with. And then from that, it emerged that there was enough demand, there was enough need for a place, a home for all these events to happen in. But of course, because they'd been happening in different locations in London, different venues, pubs, clubs, a proper auditoria and so on, the events were very, very many, very diverse, required very different environments. And I suppose that was the biggest challenge. How do you make one place that can be home to so many different types of events? So that was, if you want, that was the brief, is, make the most flexible and adaptable building you can. And so when we are hit by the epidemic and by COVID and we're locking down, in many ways, that plays out very well because you've got trucks in the yard delivering food. You've got the demonstration kitchen making food, and there are other kitchens if you wanted to use them. And the project somehow has this, it's a terrible word to use, or acronym to use, DNA, that runs through from the beginning of being very nimble and very versatile. And that's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Excellent. Yeah, I remember it's very much based on a kind of, for anyone that hasn't been there, it's based on like a grid, sort of a structural grid, which various rooms and auditoriums are kind of inserted into, and from the street front as a sort of a Pompidou Centre-like light show of what's happening inside to the to people passing by. And it just makes me think about the kind of architecture that we might need to build in the future and the kind of spaces we might need to build. We might need to build buildings which other things can be plugged into and unplugged, and other spaces can be adapted and folded into. And I wonder if, Fanny, if we could bring you in here and just talk about, maybe introduce Teatro Mundi and how you think about the city and what the inside and outside kind of spaces are, and what it means to create an architecture and who makes it.
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, Will, for the introduction and the invitation. And yeah, so I'm here representing Teatro Mundi, which is a charitable research organization that focuses on developing or bringing together architects and urbanists together with artists and people working in the performing and visual arts to talk about the city and engage both sides, if you like, or multiple sides on the crafts of city making. And in that process, we try to use different methodologies and work with different kind of means, both performances, workshops, texts, different formats. And in that sense, we use very well the digital means and the digital tools, as well as the physical space and the city, because eventually we talk about the city, right? Yeah, I mean, we have different streams of work, and currently I think the one that I can bring into the discussion is very much the work we are doing on cultural infrastructure and the study on, let's say, the urban backstages, those hidden spaces, not, you know, at the forefront of arts and the art venues and cultural venues, where the culture is produced by small, unincorporated, perhaps, cultural actors. We look at different case studies, railway arches, the, you know, studios where you have different units and people rent out studios, makers spaces, co-working spaces, different kind of, if you like, production making format, but also, you know, economic, if you like, formats and conditions, and in that sort of arrangements, adaptability or flexibility, and the idea that at every moment you are able to adapt your own space, you are able to have a power over your production space, over the means of the production, the outcome of the production, is very, very important. And depending on, obviously, the setting under which you are the planning agenda or the planning regulation of the space you are occupying, perhaps the community that surrounds you, this creates different range of vulnerabilities in that kind of spectrum of you know, producing in the city and for the city. So I think that space is definitely one. Adaptability of the space itself, it's one, but we can also talk about adaptability of legal frameworks, of, you know, of rental agreements, of community involvement, and so on. So yes, expanding on that notion that you discussed before with Alex.
Yeah, there's I think we'll probably talk a bit later, but you have these lovely case studies in the cultural infrastructure of the railway arches around Elephant and Castle, and about how on the south side there's the Latin community that are kind of divided and subdivided and subdivided as the rents go up and kind of their needs change. And on the north side of Elephant, you've got kind of a plug-in pop-up sort of cultural workspace, which comes with a ready subdivided with quite high rents, where people say, you know, we can't get anything cheaper than this is brilliant, but they don't know that the other side there's actually self-made cultural space. And before we move on to introduce others, I just wanted to ask you as well about kind of what you term culture at Teatro Mundi, because I think a lot of people and a lot of us here, especially with JW3 being an arts venue as well as many other things, will think of culture as visual arts, theatre, and the artistic arts, but you take a much broader spectrum of culture.
Yes, I guess that it would be very hard to say like a definition on top of my head, right? And I think culture is everything that surrounds us, and it comes from much multiple and more sources that we think or that we imagine that have the authority to pronounce themselves as cultural producers, right? So apart from the obvious, the people, the artists, the people that are supporting arts, the backstages, the people that, you know, provide the equipment or provide or amplify or support the work of artists, we'd also talk about people that might not on the first side produce culture. Like, for example, it comes to my mind, you know, people that, sorry.
That's why you jumped a little bit, but that's part of the magic of Zoom. So that's
yes, sorry, please do interrupt me if the signal breaks down. Yeah, so it comes to my mind, people running, you know, Latin American restaurants and cafes that apart from serving food, right, and they really support the community in terms of their communal spaces, gathering spaces, people arriving in the area, they are their first kind of space where they would come and ask for help. If they don't speak the language, they would ask, you know, people to translate documents. They would ask like where, you know, it kind of like a network hub connecting people searching for homes or for working spaces. It's much more than just, you know, and how can one say that this is not like contributing to establishing a culture, right? So obviously we can talk for the fine arts, but we are much more open to see who produces culture and who, at the end of the day, through that production of culture, through that you know, the work that they do in whatever way that they want to define it contributes to the urban landscape that we experience every day.
That's great, thank you. And it's a really nice segue to introduce Lauren from the, and I'm going to get this wrong, the Lawrence Batley Theatre. Have I got that correct?
Right, that's absolutely right.
Perfect. Lots of new organisations, and it's really interesting. Lots of new organisations. When lockdown hit in, you know, I was one of the first people to look through all of the links of all the cultural organisations that were doing live opera, live theatre, the free music listings, all that, and I was devouring it all, going, this lockdown's brilliant. I can watch the Zurich Symphony Orchestra, I can watch Met Opera. And I know you have been doing similar things from your theatre, but also let's talk about, following on from what Fanny was just talking about, who your audience is and how you reach them from your theatre and how digital has changed that. And also, you know, what are the benefits or the downsides of this kind of free-for-all digital landscape where I can suddenly, you know, watch a theatre in Huddersfield, a play for free, and I might never visit Huddersfield and they might never visit your theatre, and I don't know how you'll benefit from that other than me having a great 2 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just also wanted to say thank you for having me this evening.
Thank you for coming, yeah.
Staying cool because it's very hot. Yeah, it's a funny one really. So we're based in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire, for those of you that don't know it. And it's not a city, it's a sort of quite big town. And for us, our audience base has always been very local. It's our local and regional audiences, definitely. Also, in terms of the lockdown and some of the challenges that threw up, you're absolutely right. It's a lot of people were really quick out the gate in being able to share content. The biggest sort of disparity between who can and who can't sort of enter in that race comes to who are the producing houses in this country and who are the receiving houses, and that's quite theatre speak, but in sort of layman's terms, it's who makes their own work and who brings work from other places. So Huddersfield is, the LBT in Huddersfield is a receiving house. Mostly we do community shows and we do panto every year. But because we're a receiving house, we rely on touring work, 365, you know, for us to make our income and build our programme. So switching to digital was a very sort of big and daunting task. And I think when we talk about people that were quick out the gate, it was people that had those archival recordings, people like the National, where they already have NT Live and it's just a case of making a few phone calls. Are we able to use it? Do we have your permissions? That sort of thing. For us, it was about really sitting down and getting our heads together and thinking, what can we do so that we are continuing to connect with the audiences and they don't just forget that we're here? Because a big part of this is that foreshadowing and that foreknowing that theatre is going to be different after. So we need to be still in people's minds. We still need to be providing something. We need to make a case. I already feel like we make a case of why we should survive and why theatre should live and all that sort of stuff. But you know, to be able to see how we can still reach out to communities became the priority, really. And then as we've gone on, we have started dabbling in producing our own materials digitally and seeing what we can do from Huddersfield to that wider reach. I suppose some of the benefits to this lockdown are that we are reaching those wider audiences that we've never been able to reach before. Some of the workshops that I've led and some of the masterclasses that I've led, I've had international following from, which is incredible for a little venue, mid-scale venue in Huddersfield to achieve that, especially as that's our first sort of digital venture. I think some of the pitfalls to this are, I think you touched on it, Will, is what's the longevity of that? Are these audiences that are then going to come back? Another pitfall would be just the sheer amount of competition. If you're online and you're digital, it's so much easier to access what everybody else is doing. Yeah. And it would be very silly of me to say that we have the budget, the means and the resources to rival somewhere like the National. It's just not the case. So I suppose in that aspect, we've been really clear that our focus in our programming and what we've been doing has been for a Huddersfield and regional West Yorkshire audience. So when we're doing our masterclasses, we're working with West Yorkshire artists. The majority of the time we are bringing other artists in, obviously, because it gives us that platform to work with people in London or in Scotland or Wales that wouldn't usually have come to Huddersfield. But in terms of how the audiences has changed, it's definitely got wider, but I'd say the strength has been in the local community rallying behind it as well.
I think it's really interesting and great to hear that you're sort of doing these workshops and masterclasses, because the instant thing, like you say, the instant reaction is to say, let's just show everyone we're still here. How can we do that? Let's show, we do things. That's what we normally do. We stand on a stage or a platform and we show people. But the instant or you probably sat down and thought about it, as I know other cultural organizations did too, but to engage, to go out and invite people sort of in. And I'm imagining, and maybe you can speak to it a bit more, it's probably found a lot of people have been more open to coming in digitally through a Zoom or for a web chat you've got or an online platform than might come through your front door normally, by reaching out to them and sort of meeting in a digital sort of middle ground.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's definitely a benefit of the digital, is that it breaks down those physical barriers that, if we bring it back to space. Will, when you and I spoke just before this about what I consider space to be in a theatre context, it's both physical but also sort of metaphorical space in your head of what you think theatre is and who it's for and all the barriers that stop you from engaging with it. So digital definitely brings down those walls, because you're in the comfort of your own home. You can turn your microphone off, you can turn your camera off, you can just sit and listen to what people are saying, and then you do one Zoom and you're muted, you do the next and you ask the question, and then you build up. So what I'm hoping is that people who have engaged with us during lockdown will then find it in themselves to make a trip to Huddersfield and come and say hello. Now as well, it gives a face to the organisation. If you're just looking at our programme online or you're on our website, I'm sure there's a very nice picture of all of us on the website somewhere, but you're not really getting a feel for who these people are, because at the end of the day, arts buildings, cultural buildings, they're run by human beings. We're all there behind the scenes. So I'm hoping that with them seeing me and engaging in a conversation with me over Zoom just for an hour, that it would entice them to come and try the real physical thing. But it is a struggle in terms of the physical aspect of our building. We have at least three thresholds you have to cross just to get into the box office. We have a sort of big courtyard outside of the venue, which is beautiful in the summer, but it has big cast iron gates and stone pillars, and it's very grand. And definitely, even me on my first day, I was like, am I allowed in here? Is that okay? So I'm definitely hoping that all the digital work we're doing and the engagement work we're doing is opening people's minds a bit to, yes, you're welcome here, please come along.
This is the huge question, and I think it goes to what the LFA kind of themed their festival about power and who holds that power. And we see it in architecture, and we see it repeated a lot in the current sort of a build better, build beautiful, and the American trad art kind of conversations that are going on. A lot of architecture, which is in Huddersfield and various grand British cities, and buildings of the arts of a traditional language, who have all these thresholds and sort of mannerisms and orders that one has to understand and get past. And that, it can work in a grand setting, but it can also put people off. And as you said on your first day, but even I get really nervous at a public event, putting my hand up to ask a question. So I can't imagine what it's like for someone, who's never even thought about going to a theatre to cross through all those thresholds and then ask a question. But it leads on nicely to Jeremy Goldstein. Thank you for waiting, Jeremy, because you don't just even expect people or ask people to ask questions. You invite them onto the stage to speak for 2 or 3 minutes about the most personal testimonies and histories and calls to power that they can pull from within. So can you speak to us a bit about that, and also about the kind of spaces you've been to and how space affects how people speak openly or to other people?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I run a project which is called the Truth to Power Cafe. And it started its life as a live show, and we've been touring the work now for about 3 years. We've toured all through Yorkshire, and we've been to Australia and Holland and Croatia and so on. And we invite participants to come and speak, perform in the show with me and respond to the question, who has power over you and what do you want to say to them? The question is quite sort of triggery. It really makes you think, you know, who you are and what your relationship is to power, be it from the personal, from the political, from the professional, and so on. And we've had people, you know, of all walks of life and different ages and experiences taking part in the project, many of whom have been first-time participants, some of whom have never even set foot inside a theatre before. I mean, I remember there was one show we were doing back in 2018 at Edge Hill in a place called Ormskirk at the Arts Centre. We had sort of 3 middle-aged guys coming into the space talking about sort of various issues, power issues they had regarding sort of substance abuse and gambling and so on. So for them to sort of get up and talk about that in front of their peers, you know, in a live show was a kind of felt like a really life kind of changing moment for them. But one of the reasons why I started the project, and I think this is sort of really where I think the conversation is going tonight, is that it's really about access and permission and feeling like ownership and empowerment. Because, you know, before I started Truth to Power Cafe, I mean, I was a theatre producer for a long time, and I was quite well established. You know, I've had a lot of some really great shows under my belt. But
tell us one. Go on, name drop.
Oh, okay, look, you can go. Well, I worked for a long time with an artist in New York called Penny Arcade, and bought a show in London in 2012, which was called Bitch Dyke Fag Hag Whore, which I'm very proud of. And it was the antidote to the London 2012 Olympics. But it was really, but it was, I mean, that show in particular, I mean, that was really a piece which platformed kind of underrepresented voices and marginalized communities. And, you know, I've done a lot of work over the years in platforming those people and those communities. And Truth to Power Cafe is, you know, very much a response to that. But also, you know, just going back to what I was saying before about like being a producer, you know, I still felt kind of marginalized within my own sector, within my own industry, because, you know, there are so many rules and regulations to the way that kind of theatre culture happens. You know, there are lots of kind of hoops you have to jump through in order to feel that you can be a part of this experience, you know, because theatre culture often kind of happens to you rather than you being initiating that, or you being part of the conversation. So, you know, I was just, you know, even though I'd been, you know, quite successful, you know, to a degree, I still felt as though my voice was not being heard. This was extremely frustrating for me, you know, sort of having spent already, you know, 20 years kind of making work. So Truth to Power Cafe kind of arose in a very sort of organic, through a very organic process. And now we're at a point now where we're just about to start a new tour. And also, like when COVID started, like just going back to the digital for a moment, I mean, I had resisted putting anything about this show on socials, on website. We didn't, you know, because you know, if you have like talking heads of people, you know, responding to that question on social media, it just doesn't really work. I think people get very bored very easily, and you just kind of switch off. And I think, you know, as an artist, I think you have to make work specifically for the medium, you know, because this show is very much a live experience. And for that reason, like I just didn't want to put it online. But when COVID hit, you know, like a lot of people, we had to cancel a lot of our dates. We lost, you know, several performances to the crisis. And it was sort of, I remember in the space of about 24 hours, I just saw about a dozen shows disappear. I just saw lots of money out the window. It was like, my God, what am I going to do? So we did, it was a very impulsive kind of move on our part, but we sort of reinvented the project, and we asked people, we retained the question, who has power over you and what do you want to say to them? But instead of doing it in a live context, we asked people to send us 1-minute videos and to respond to the question in the context of those videos. And so far, like we've published about 60 videos now. I've put them on our Facebook page. They've been seen over 60,000 times. I mean, it's been phenomenal because, I would never be able to do the show for that kind of audience, it's quite a small scale piece. I mean, we normally, our audiences are anywhere from like 100 to sort of 200-300 people. So to sort of find that audience within the space of about sort of 6-8 weeks is kind of really reinvented the work, and it's taken the project to people in ways in which I never really imagined possible.
Well, I think that's a nice segue. We can, I think we've got a couple of videos lined up, and I think if Joe at JW3 could start the first one, which is Paul, who's maybe one of the people you didn't expect to take part in things, but he speaks really well to, I think, what Fanny's talking about and what will come up in the conversation about the kind of the spaces of urban and architecture where culture is made and who that culture is for. So if the tech works, can we watch? There we go. A minute of Paul. There we go.
My name is Paul Atherton. I've been homeless for 10 years. I suffer with a disability known as chronic fatigue syndrome, and in the main, I sleep here in Heathrow Terminal 5. When I'm not here, I'm out gallivanting, doing all the kind of things that most people think take a lot of money to do in central London. It doesn't. It just needs you to understand how London works. So the free theatre tickets come from audience filling. The premieres at the Leicester Square Odeon just turn up in the morning. And as for free food in restaurants, well, that comes from knowing when restaurants are opening and when they need tasters. My truth to power is to government, to politics, to the DWP, to financial institutions. All of these things have taken away my right to live a good life. The DWP tell me, no, you must be filling in lots of forms and running around like a headless chicken so that we can decide whether or not you're capable of work. Well, work I am capable at. The problem is, it's the way they want me to work that is the problem. Financial institutions tell me I have to share my money with, my information with them. And in so doing, they then control my life. And the government just wants to control everything. I'm free. I'm not a number or a digit or something just to be controlled. I am me, and I'm speaking truth to power.
Thank you. Let's come back to the room. It's really nice to hear people that possibly wouldn't normally be speaking their truth, and like you say, to a much wider audience. And I think now we've all sort of introduced ourselves, and we've all had a little bit of the stage, digital stage. Feel free to interject and interrupt with each other and contribute. But I think maybe if either Fanny or Alex pick up, because I'm just interested there in what he was saying about, he had this lovely phrase, if you understand how London works. And obviously we're not just talking about London, but it's a very key example with lots of massive cultural infrastructure either having just been built or in the pipeline, new music centres and big museums and extensions to museums and so on and so forth. Is London working? Is our approach to architecture and cultural space working? And if not, what can architecture do to solve that? Overview, big question.
I mean, I did some research. We were doing a project, a theatre project, and most of the directors, I'd be interested in what you have to say, Jeremy. Most of the directors and producers much preferred working in converted premises. In other words, theatres or clubs or halls that had been different things over time. And most of them were really anxious about spaces that were created as a sort of single marvelous entity in an architectural sort of masterpiece. I'd be interested in what you have to say, but there's something about the fact that the most extraordinary culture very often comes from very odd places, and you can't I mean, that was a conundrum with JW3. I always said, well, look, if we're going to do this, it's got to be a place where culture is made as well as consumed. It can't just be, a place where you go and sit and watch stuff. And what's interesting is Raymond Simonson, who runs it, and his team, we're one of his 5,000 events per annum. I mean, they get close to 250,000 people into a small building, and that is nothing. I'm not being ultra modest here, but it's not to do with the architecture very much. It's actually 90% due to the way in which the building is allowed to be appropriated by different kinds of voices. So over to you, Jeremy, or anyone else. Tell me what's so off-putting, because that's the message I get. What's so off-putting about a single authored space?
Well, 1 in 5 people in this country live in poverty. That's 20% of the population who are not ever going to feel that they can enter a theatre, because they just can't afford the theatre tickets, I feel like there needs to be, people just needs to raise their kind of level of consciousness to understand that we can't just go back to how things were before COVID, because it's just, society as it is just is not working, I mean, we have to find ways to kind of really engage with people in such a way that they feel really empowered to kind of pick up and be in control of their own lives, and to be able to do that kind of, I mean, it's wonderful, like if they can do that kind of through the arts and through the culture, but the power systems that operate in our venues, in our theatres, especially in producing houses, in that you've got these very, most kind of producing theatres are run as fiefdoms. So you've got these roles, artistic director roles, where the power within in all these institutions are just focused around kind of one person. Or a very small team at the top of these institutions that like to work with people they know, that commission writers they know. It's all about kind of who you know. So if you're like a first-time participant, someone trying to engage in the arts for the first time, you're going to kind of really struggle to have your voice heard and to have your work performed in any of these big theatres. This is why I think the future is not in places like the Royal Opera House. It is not in places like the National Theatre. It's really happening, because theatre is so much about people. This industry is all about just people kind of feeling empowered to kind of really get out there and actually make something of themselves. And those buildings, I can't say they're all like this, but a lot of the time, those buildings are seen as a barrier, for inclusion. And one thing I would really love to say, I would love to see happen in this country, I would love to see the government double the Arts Council budget and really empower that organization to get out there and really do the work which they want to do. I mean, just, as part of COVID, I mean, I remember, when COVID came up, I mean, they suspended all grant applications to the Arts Council. They very quickly, they brought in £160 million emergency fund, which, thankfully, people like me, I was able to apply for, and we were successful. I think they funded 10,000 people and organizations around the country that wouldn't normally get funded. Well, they should be able to do that every year. And just think of the difference it would make.
They should. I mean, it's worth pointing out as well that a lot of Arts Council money just went to, or largely went to the front of stage people, the artists who were making, or the performers, or the venues which were struggling. And don't get me wrong, all often totally worthy of the money. I know of an awful lot of people anecdotally who are the backstage people, as Fanny talked about, who, you know, small practitioners, small businesses who create props for film and theatre and write things, who are not supported by the government in any way whatsoever. And you know, it's so easy to forget about the people that are backstage. It's interesting as well, talking about who you know and the thing, and I'm glad you went on to Arts Council, because it's something I think that we need to talk about. I was listening to Frances Morris of Tate Modern talk, I think just this morning, and she was saying, you know, now is not the time. Tate is already wants to pull back from the big blockbusters, and we want to go hyper local and engage more with local community, and Tate do that. But Tate, of course, have the luxury of being able to do that. They've got a ziggurat of a building, you know, full of community spaces, and they're not going to have their Arts Council money taken away. Fanny, if I could just bring you back in, where would you put money if you had some of the Arts Council budget? Like, would it go on like the new music centre in the Barbican, or would it go on, you know, a new V&A museum somewhere, or maybe just buy up all National Rail arches and give them to communities?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say a few things before I answer that question, because I think it's a trick question. It's not as straightforward as it sounds. Let's go for the small and low key. I totally agree with Jeremy that the whole situation put the focus on the individual to some extent, and to like gave through the digital and access to the, you know, to this kind of, you know, free from space limitations, location, accessibility, and so on. It did put empowered the individual and the individual means of producing, as well as you know, receiving and transmitting and broadcasting work. At the same time, though, it did expose inequalities of great extent, inequalities between who has, from basic stuff like who has access to a quick or a rapid Wi-Fi, to have you know, like the luxury of having a house that you are not disturbed with family members, and you can still, you know, work. And I'm talking about many articles that have been written about females or mothers and how they have not being able to be productive in the home space. They are inequalities of where is your home. So for example, being in disadvantaged neighborhoods where you don't have access to well-maintained parks, or you don't have access to community spaces, or you're not even close to Tate or any kind of that sort of spacious and large square meters space, right? We are big, and with different kind of inequalities, and that kind of really deprive you from a lot of social practices and spatial practices that has to do with education, that has to do with your well-being, has to do with your private life, personal, you know, mental health, and so on and so forth. And I think in that sense, yes, I feel that we cannot go back to where we were, for sure, because now we have seen what it means to, you know, to take things perhaps, or to be able to be empowered as an individual. But I think what the virtual cannot necessarily done as well as, you know, in a physical situation is, and perhaps Lauren can add more to that, is the community, where, you know, this kind of face-to-face interaction and things that they're only you can only really gain from, or you can really understand, or you can really experience, and they empower you as an individual through being in a community, not as being on your own. And to that extent, I think there is, and again, with the risk of being too diplomatic here, I think we need a range of situations, because a range of situations give the opportunity to a range of individuals, cooperatives, collaborations, schemes, funding schemes, political situation, like name it, whatever, practices, backstage, front stage, you know, to exist and coexist at the same time. And in an ideal world, that would complement instead of each other, instead of compete each other, right? So yes, I do think you need a Tate And I think you need, you know, perhaps more than one Tate, so that is not like a mono, you know, a kind of how do you say that, a monopoly. But at the same time, you need many individual, independent, unincorporated, different formats, alternative forms of production, individuals, collectives, and, you know, perhaps we can think of new hybrid also forms of producing culture, receiving culture, whatever that is.
I think, yeah. I'd just like to, as you said as well, I'd like to maybe throw that also over to Lauren. And it relates, we have an anonymous question from one of the people watching, which I think ties into what you were just saying, Fanny, which is, as theatre and culture has largely been free during this time, and therefore, as we talked about, so much more accessible, how can culture continue to be accessible after the lockdown? And I'd extend that, Lauren, if you want to jump in here. It's like, at a time, you know, of what looks like continued austerity, and there will be economic crash and Arts Council funding, you know, if it does carry on going to Tate, and we still also want to contribute to makers and all of the other kind of people in the ecosystem. And there's the added burden now, after COVID perhaps, of art spaces and cultural spaces and theatres and all sorts, having to enact some kind of social care, or, you know, willing and unwilling maybe, to be a key part of what community is, rather than just the stage to project from. That's going to take a lot more funding, isn't it? And at a time when people are so used to getting, you know, downloading their play for free, how are we going to build this world?
Yeah.
If you don't have the answer, that's fine.
Go on, Lauren, tell us.
Oh, I wish I had the answer. I don't have an answer to this, but it is something that was obviously thrown up, I think, like, not even at the beginning of lockdown, like maybe 3 weeks in, when people had already piled on so much stuff. We'd already had 3 rounds of National Theatre Live. Suddenly everybody stopped and was like, oh no, we've done all this to keep engaged, to keep our names out there, to keep people entertained, to keep people interacting with us. But now how do we sort of safeguard, and I'll use the word safeguard, it's not about just generating an income for an income's sake. It's about how you continue working. How are we going to continue making these beautiful productions, whether they're seen live or digitally, if everything is for free and there is no, you know, there's no resource. The biggest sort of resource for us as a collective sector is the Arts Council, and that has sort of been decimated by this crisis, and you know, and rightly so that money gets shared out between the artists that need it and are in really difficult times right now. But it does beg the question of where are we at after. And even in conversations that I know that the Arts Council are having, they're still grappling with that. But it was the right thing to do at the time, I think, to go, we need to repurpose this and we need to just respond to now. Going to the question of how do we move from a free, having all this from free, to going back to how we were. I think that it ties in really well to what Jeremy said, in that we need to be looking at a different way of working. I'm not all for going back to the way we were for a number of reasons, in terms of accessibility, diversity, these barriers that were up, whether they're physical or otherwise. There was a lot to unpick before COVID, and there'll be even more to unpick after. But what I don't think we should do is just fall into the same trap of going, let's just get good content out there with names that we know and people that we like to work with and things that we think is quality. I think it's about shifting focus and shifting power at every level of the theatre industry, whether it's even in the spaces that you're curating. And you mentioned previously that the conversation about repurposing spaces or building new spaces. And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to that, but I think it's a case of, for me, the process of what that space is going to be needs community interaction and input of a diverse range of voices and people from the very beginning. From the very, very beginning. And then that also then needs to feed into how that building makes its work, how it reaches out into its community, and then the work that it programs to come into the community. To me, if I could repurpose funding in any way, it would be in terms of a venue perspective. I would shift the balance of power to those departments that are working with the communities rather than just on artistic output, because they're doing many, many more projects than the shows that you see on stage, for half, a quarter, an eighth of the budget, and hitting more people in terms of the enrichment factor. And in the community work that I've done in Doncaster, there was 2 strands of work. It was a Creative People and Places project, which was funded by the Arts Council. One strand was in big theatrical experiences, and the other was in grassroots. We picked 3 villages and did grassroots community projects. Obviously, with the big theatrical stuff, we were hitting thousands of people every year. In the grassroots community stuff, hundreds. However, those hundreds of people that came to those small scale events and returned time and time again, some people even changed their career path, wanted to become artists, made them think that it was for them, you know. And to me, that will always have the greater power than, oh, we sold out tonight. You know, as Fanny said, it's to be diplomatic. There should be a space for everything. But if we're talking about in a best case scenario, and if you had to spend the money, you had to put it down somewhere, for me, it would always be about the enrichment rather than the spectacle.
That's a nice time.
Yeah, I don't know if I've answered all of that.
No, it's fine. We weren't, going to send Rishi Sunak to you to get all the answers. And I'm not entirely sure that he and this government would be that interested at the moment, because it's great what you're saying. If you do an outreach program, that's grassroots in these 3 villages, and you're teaching kids how to play a violin, how to stand and speak, what a poem is, how to engage with one another. This is something that will tool them up and they'll take into whatever they do, whether they become artists or, more likely, working in a shop, in a factory, as a banker, in any other thing. And this is the language of STEM, has been really powerful and really good at pushing its logic into the sort of academia world and in the funding world. And it's pushed STEAM and the arts to one side. And it sounds like artists and cultural practitioners are really good at speaking to the communities. But how, if any of you have the answer, how are we going to now convince people with actual power and money to see the benefit of the huge ecosystem and the trickle down, because they love that phrase, the trickle down, which is not just seen in financial numbers and 100,000 visitors a year?
I think just to jump in as well, I think the sort of messaging that we've seen in the media as well about theatre closures and those sorts of things has been very one-sided to sort of the big West End, big commercial venues, when in actual fact, the stuff that's getting hit probably the hardest is these regional theatres and smaller scale organisations. I think to just go to your last point, Will, I don't know if we can convince people who are at the top right now, but I think in doing this community outreach work and enriching people at certain ages and levels of engagement, that's where you build a value to the arts. And they start to see how it enriches their lives, which then means that the money that is spent on the arts through their taxpayer money, they then feel like it's money well spent, and then don't start arguing with you about roads and stuff like that when you start having a conversation about funding. Yeah. So to me, it comes in at a very, very early level. Like, we have to back ourselves. We have to back the arts just as much as we back funding for sports in schools and for STEM. It's not just about getting on a stage and performing. It's about enriching every aspect of your life and seeing how the arts can add value to a public's life, and also into well-being on top of that. And I think once we've cracked that and people start seeing a value to it, then we'll start seeing that reflected when the next generation are in power and are feeding down and trickling down, like you said. Let's hope
that when that generation come into power, we still have the theatres and the galleries and the orchestras and everything. If I can move to Alex, moving on from that, I think it's really important that we are using this opportunity to maybe think about what can be done afresh and anew. And there's another question that's come in from the audience watching. without physical space, what are the best ways to foster connections and share culture online? But also, and I think yourself, Alex, what can we take from this new digital reality back into the world once we come back from COVID? I mean, what can we learn from this in a spatial way? How can we introduce some of the things that we've picked up back into architecture in the physical world? Because we know now it's so important to still have human contact.
Yeah, well, a lot of what we're talking about is who runs the spaces and how they're funded, and it's a big problem. And you can't solve that here. One of the interesting things we've been involved with over the years, where it started at Coin Street in the 1980s, was festivals and the opening up, for instance, of the river and public spaces in London, the public realm in London, to culture that is made on the street, if you want. So, for instance, a chap called Adrian Evans started at Coin Street with a wire walk across the river in 1974, and then from that launched the Thames Festival, which is a huge festival with lots of outreach, all the things that you guys have been talking about. And more recently, we've been doing quite an interesting project with an American artist called Leo Villarreal, lighting 14 London bridges with his art, which is digital, and it's created in a very novel way. And it's a sort of free art form for all. It's sponsored by a foundation, the Illuminated River Foundation, so that money had to be found, but was found by some very interesting sponsors. So I think that's where the future is. And post-COVID, how are we going to fill theatres with seats jammed, with people jammed next to each other? It may take 2 or 3 years for this epidemic to be dealt with in one way or another, whether it's by vaccine or whether, like the Spanish flu, it just disappears magically. So it's funny that buildings have become more expensive to run and now may not easily be afforded anyway. So, but maybe we all have to move to the outside and actually use the city in a much more democratic way and a much more lively way, and create these very spontaneous and much more sort of grassroots forms of art. So maybe, I don't know, maybe architecture has nothing to say about that, but
as long as the
it's
weather
certainly
stays,
a very exciting field.
As long as the weather stays like it has been this last few days, that won't be a problem. But it probably
well,
won't.
Look, in London, it's not very, very cold even in the winter, and it's actually there's something actually quite brilliant about being out in. Look, the world is going to change. It needs to change. We need to move away from motor cars. We need to move away from forms of pollution that we're all aware of. And today we're now 50% producing power from renewable sources. So there are encouraging signs. I just think, like all of you, that we need government to fund that change. We're at the point of change. If we can get that funding, we can just tip that point over. And then we would have, as we did in the 1960s as a country, which was also unequal and had also huge problems. Was created here, was an extraordinary cultural revival in this country. And if I've just been reading the Beatles book, 1, 2, 3, 4 by Craig Brown. I mean, it's staggering the number of artists that were influenced and that rose out of art schools and apparently very ordinary clubs and pubs, and created a culture here that was, the envy of the world, and actually enfranchised many people who would otherwise have been clerks or coal miners or whatever. They actually changed the world.
It makes a good point. You make a good point, because culture, historically, when we look back at moments of culture, they aren't the ones which necessarily have been programmed and organized and dictated about what this event will be. We look back like the Great Festival of Britain and things, but culture really is like as a softer beast, things which happened over time, and often not by always the big people. But it takes me back to what you were just saying about, and I think they're beautiful, the lit up rivers and bridges and so on and so forth. But it's about power and who makes those spaces in the city. And, it might take a mayor of London or a philanthropist who, may or may not want their individual corporate name attached to something. But in my view, that creates a certain kind of city and a certain kind of power held in that city about who might access it and what art functions for. And often we find it functioning for capital or finance rather than necessarily agency and civic community. And I wonder if we can just take back, we have to wrap up in about 10 minutes, I think. Let's take it back to Fanny. And if you could make, I know maybe you don't have anything, but something about the power of the city and how do we get the voices which come up through the cracks and maybe aren't the people who would know how to get 20 million from Mayor of London for a fantastic kind of urban practice. But how do those voices filter up, and who owns the city in that sense? If you're still there, Fanny, we might have lost our connection.
Sorry, yes, sorry.
Like
That's another.
Greece, can you hear me?
True, that's another big question. I want to take it from what Alex said, like the big question of who owns the space, because we have to, and we can bring the example of London very much, where even if you go outdoors, much of the public space is not even public. It is privatized. So you cannot actually do whatever you want in many parts of what is considered shared outdoor, you know, in between space. Of course, maybe that is more of a, you know, kind of a characteristic of London more than other cities, let's say, but still it is an increasing phenomenon that we see in metropolitan cities, where, if you like, you might have the most employment opportunities, therefore you might have more density of populations and more kind of, you know, way or incentives to go outdoors if we don't understand the virus or we don't find a vaccine the next 2-3 years. These are the employment centers that have to and I don't only mean financially, but I mean in all kinds of ways. So I think that who owns the space, who runs it, and who funds it is like extremely crucial. To add to that is we still don't know much about the virus. So actually, if we are, as architects, to design offices or to see how we can reconfigure offices, we don't know much about, you know, how much of distance is enough. Is it airborne? Is it right? How does it work with the system? Do we have ventilation that can still allows for people to move in? How does it work with interactions and business meetings? And, you know, are you in the most segregated or deep office more secure than if you are in an open air? You know, it's on an open office. It's like so many things that we know that, you know, it is transmittable through surfaces, but for how long? And, you know, all this kind of data that and evidence that you need to be able to say that, yes, as architects, we can have a vital impact, if you like, or a say on how we can go back to whatever that is. And again, as we said, like, how can we move that outdoors, or how can we combine the two, or how can, now that we're becoming more and more, let's say, accustomed or well versed with digital means and digital platforms and security over digital, you know, how can we combine perhaps the two? You know, we are an organization that at the moment only 2 people are based in London out of the 8. All of the rest are spread. I'm actually myself in Greece. We are in France, in Paris, in Lille, in Cardiff. Everyone is somewhere else, and we still are able, luckily, to be fully functionable. But at the same time, it is hard when you have constant Zoom meetings. You know, you're not as productive. So, you know, raises all kind of issues. So again, I don't have a clear answer. I think there are many unknown things that we are only start discussing, and we are only start scratching the surface.
I think, and just so everyone knows, watching and participating, we're going to go on until about 10 past because it's such a big subject and there's so many of us. And there's one question I just want to read out from a member of the public. And I think it also speaks to what you're just saying, because I've noticed it today going out for a walk. Traffic, you know, if nature's returning, as everyone likes to say online, traffic certainly is returning. We saw the beaches, you know, in Britain completely rammed. So if we know one thing, it's people do want to get back to normal very quickly, even if collectively or individually we know normal in whatever factor wasn't necessarily working. Maybe I can bring Jeremy back in, and if you can maybe speak to this question that's come in from Maria Shuri-Smith. who is a participation producer herself, and so she agrees with a lot of stuff we've been talking about. But how do we avoid that going back to normal? How do we, as she asks, make a stronger case for participatory work to take a greater priority, I think in the arts, but also just culturally and ethically and probably socially within our kind of community world. In the arts sector, how do we let them take up a greater space and not just return back to normal into, you know, the big budget, commercially profitable things that we know and we're really happy to have back?
We need to listen more.
Listen.
Stop killing people, that would help. I mean, wow, it's a big question. I mean, I think there just needs to be a revolution in this country over how...
Revolution of listening, wouldn't that be
Revolution of listening. Let's, you know, stop trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, I just feel like there really needs to be a revolution in this country over how the arts is funded. You know, and people need to understand that that if enough people stand up and say that what our old normal is unacceptable, then, you know, things could change. I mean, you only have to look at like protest movements, you know, what's going on at the moment, Black Lives Matter. I mean, absolutely. Direct action really works, you know. So, you know, I mean, it's a long-term thing, isn't it? You know, it probably is not going to happen in my generation as much as I wish it would. And I think, you know, every time there is a new generation, you know, things do improve, you know. Although having said that, I also don't really have much hope given the government that we've got at the moment. But, you know, another thing we could do is just getting young people up into leadership roles, you know, who have got the energy to think about things in a different way, you know, through a lens which is going to affect their future. You know, I mean, I hate the elephant in the room, but, you know, Brexit, I mean, look what's happened there. I mean, it's just removed so many opportunities for young people. I mean, if you had young people in those roles deciding if whether or not we would leave the European Union, I mean, the answer would be a resounding no.
So on the subject, we do have to wrap up in a minute. I want to, before we finish, I just wanted everyone, if they're willing to do their own truth to power, which can be short, it can be a one sentence, who you might be saying your truth to power for, and it might or might not relate to some of the things we've been talking about. But I just wanted to add, before I say thank you to everyone, I just wanted to add that if we are going to have a revolution of listening, there's probably no better place to start than lots of those videos, Jeremy, on your Truth to Power Cafe, many of which are on your website and being passed out through the London Festival of Architecture. And I think going up to the Lawrence Batley Theatre in Huddersfield, I think once we're back to normal, the quote again, and hopefully again at JW3 for Holocaust Memorial Day. Lots of listening to do there, lots of diverse and new young voices who, having listened to some of them, should have some of that power handed back to them, maybe, or handed back to them, given to them for the first time. So if we can, before we sort of say our thank yous and goodbye, maybe starting with Alex, because I can see you here on the screen for some reason, a truth to power. Would you have a 1 or 2 sentence truth to power? Who would it be and what would your call be for?
I don't have I've never had any limitations on what I do. I'm a very fortunate person in that respect. The person who's limited me most is myself. And I have a feeling that although there are many restrictions and there are many inequalities, I have a feeling that people are able and are more open to change. And I'll just give you an example of a charity that I'm a trustee of that represents people who've lived through terrible childhood traumas. It's called Body and Soul. And they have stepped up during the COVID crisis and they have scaled up their operation. They've taken advantage of it to reach a much bigger audience of people who are, our members are mostly BAME and or were HIV. And those are the two most disadvantaged groups, and yet they are now in full focus. So I think there are opportunities for disadvantaged groups and disadvantaged communities to step up and to actually take control, but it does require initiative of a kind that we haven't seen, and we have to try and find ways to celebrate that.
Absolutely. So Truth to Power is calling on us all to celebrate that and be aware of those voices. Lauren, a truth to power?
Oh, I did sort of think about this earlier, and I was like, oh my gosh. So I think my truth to power would be to, looking at this from a very early career theatre maker, it would be to the people who currently pull the strings in theatre, if you will. So my truth to power would be something like, stop being afraid to take risks, celebrate and embrace those people who come to shake the table, because there is no seat for them there. Let them shake it and embrace that. Throughout in parts of my career, and then just as in life as a Black woman, I've been called difficult. I'm only 27, so I can't be that difficult yet. I'm hoping I've got a little bit more difficulty to come, and I'm learning to sort of embrace that difficultness, if you like, because I think it means I'm doing something right in the industry. So I just want to sort of say to those powers that be, if you like, and also I think a wider one to government, embrace these people that come to shake the table, because they want the same thing you do. They want everything to be successful, and they want everything to be great. We're all here to make greatness and make great things happen in space and in culture. So
shaking the table, I'm up for that.
Table.
Fanny, a call to power?
I guess it would go to everyone that they feel their personal or physical space, their time is being threatened at these times, whether we talk about pandemic, whether we talk about racism, whether we talk about politics and finance, whatever crisis, migrant crisis, whatever. I feel like find your way to if you are not supported, find the means to amplify your voice and have your voice heard, and make sure you have your own space in the city, wherever that is.
Thank you. Excellent. And Jeremy, I think you've probably thought about this question before, but do you have one as well?
I'll have many. No, I mean, I mean, in the show, you know, I talk about my father as the person who had power over me when he was alive. So I talk a lot about that in the show. But tonight, I just really feel at the moment, you know, we're all kind of under the thumb of this government. And, you know, I really feel that right now, you know, this moment in time, they have an enormous amount of power over us. And I think they're not being responsible with it, being very irresponsible in the way that they're managing the crisis. I think they're just I don't know who they're governing for, because they don't represent me.
West Ferry developers, I think, and the Docklands. My own call to power, I think, and I've been thinking about this, is as Alex said, it's interesting that, you know, he hasn't had to face much power and opposition, and similarly, you know, as a white man in a world that's sort of built around me and for me and in my shape, as Le Corbusier kind of drew, I haven't also had to. And so my call to power is, I guess, to people who aren't aware that they have the power, self included. And I've been recently, I think I know a lot about cities and architecture and spatial planning, but realizing through the Black Lives Matter movement, actually, there's a whole lot of stuff I don't know about. And so calling on me and people like me and other people in their sectors to sort of be aware of those bits of the conversation which, you know, through inadvertently have not been shaking that table, as Lauren so beautifully said. So with that, I think thank you to everyone. I just want to say thank you as well to JW3 hugely, who, you know, this is a free event. You know, it's going to be online, so people can watch it at another time and accessible. So if anyone is in a position to donate, then I think there's a link. McKellar's just jw3.org.uk/support-us. And if you can't at the moment, that's fine. And there's obviously, as we've just discussed, hundreds of thousands of other great social, cultural, community charities and organisations which we all need to shake the tables in support of, and our wallets as much as we can at the moment. So if everyone can just say thank you as well, so we know you're still there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.